Hello, this is Dr. Scott Denstead, founder of EZWxBrief, your best online source for aviation weather and education. Welcome to episode 23 of EZWxChat, a program to discuss various topics related to aviation weather. And once again, thanks for joining today. In this episode, I'm going to discuss and maybe even ramble on a little bit about weather education and talk a little bit about maybe some misinformation that does unfortunately appear on the internet with respect to aviation weather. So there are a number of elements to this. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them in the time frame we have, but in general, the concept of weather education, the FAA, and kind of all the different alphabet soup groups like AOPA and EA and such do try to make sure that pilots know the basics of weather education. Unfortunately, they kind of fall short in many different areas, and that's potentially leading to some incidents and accidents, and if not, it just makes people very frustrated when they try to plan a flight. Now, let me just first of all start out before I get knee deep into this topic and talk a little bit about the elements here that you see here on the screen right now, and that is I have this set up as a progressive web app. I know this is an unfamiliar topic to most people. Most people usually go to the App Store and download the app. Well, this is a progressive web app. That means you don't have to fool around with Apple. You don't have to go to your Google Play Store and download the app. Instead, this is a progressive web app, and essentially it's a web-based application that runs in a browser but using what's called a progressive web app concept. And this is available on Windows, on Mac, as well as your portable devices such as an iPad or iPhone, or even a portable Android device. And so if you set it up that way, the user experience is going to be much better. And you can see here on this particular case, you see that there isn't any kind of back or forward buttons. There's no address bar. Essentially, the application takes up complete control of the complete screen, and you can minimize it just like any other internet browser situation, but you definitely want to do this, and the best approach here is take just a couple of minutes, go up to the start button on anywhere the start button appears, and then view the pilot's guide. The pilot's guide will have a lot of good information, and so I always recommend folks just give it a brief read. I know it's a pretty long document, trying to be as complete as possible, but you'll see in the very beginning here the progressive web app installation instructions. So find your particular browser or your device, go to that. So for instance, if I want to install this progressive web app on my iPad or iPhone, you click on that, it'll take you right to that section. And it's pretty simple. You just bring up the Safari browser, you type in EZWxBrief.com into the browser, and then at that point in time you'll see that little send to button, and it may appear in a different place depending on whether you have your iPad rotated one direction or another, or in an iPhone, but it's the same send to or share button. Tap or click on that, and then say, scroll down that menu and tap on Add to Home Screen, and then eventually tap on Add, and that will add a icon to your home screen on your iPad or iPhone. And you can do the same thing for other devices. For instance, if you're on a MacBook or iMac, unfortunately you can't use Safari. It's kind of weird that you can't use Safari, but you can use Chrome. And once you bring Chrome up, you'll see kind of a download symbol, same kind of thing. tap on that and it'll allow you to install EZWxBrief as a progressive web app. It'll put an icon right on your home page. You can do that same thing with a Windows device running Microsoft Edge or Chrome. Either one of those work really well. So I wanted to bring that up because I know a lot of folks are sending me screenshots, issues they're finding and such, which is great, but it looks like they're not set up as a progressive web app. So take the moment and do that. Again, it doesn't take any length of time to set that up. And in the end, when there are new releases, they just appear there. There's no need to go out and grab an update from the App Store, Google Play Store for any updates. So you don't have to worry about that at all. So I'm not going to do a lot of show and tell today. We'll look at this wonderful image here of tomorrow morning in the Northeast while I go through. But in general, when you're looking at the overall weather education, most pilots get a fairly reasonable level of education during their primary training. And for the most part, they continue to work pretty hard at learning how to do pre-flight analysis. Now, one of the major issues is that even in all of the FAA literature that you can get through the handbooks, through the AIM, through any advisory circulars, I'm not saying that that information is incorrect or not very useful, but there's a lot to read behind, between the lines of a lot of that information. And perhaps the biggest problem is really that pilots are not able to get a good understanding of the big weather picture when it comes to weather. And there are tons and tons of aspects of meteorology that I don't expect most pilots to understand, and that's okay. I don't believe that. When I first started out teaching, I tried to teach pilots to become a meteorologist, but realized pretty quickly 25 years ago that that was not the best approach. It was better to try to orient them to various aspects of weather and then eventually teach them how to do proper pre-flight briefings. And so that when you look at weather education in general, you're looking at kind of a couple of different prongs to the approach here. There's all the basic weather principles, like what causes icing, what causes turbulence, what causes thunderstorms, or essentially why do I get icing at certain temperatures and not other temperatures, and what's the difference between a laminar mountain wave and one that's turbulent. There's lots of those kind of basic elements of weather that pilots should try to understand. It gives them a better appreciation for what's happening in the atmosphere. It gives them a kind of a better realization for what weather's all about, what makes weather tick, so to speak. Then there's the products themselves, the weather products, whether it's a terminal forecast, whether it's a METAR or surface observation, or in some cases whether it's even one of the many different static weather images that you see here in EZWxBrief. It really doesn't matter per se, but you have to kind of understand how these products are built or what they're telling you and how to interpret them. And of course it's going to be difficult because each one of these has a different challenge to understand what it's telling you, what it's not telling you, and then you have to apply that to your route of flight. And given today that there are just tons and tons of different websites out there, even just within the National Weather Service itself, lots of weather guidance available. And for the most part, you're taught fairly reasonably well how to use the basic elements such as air mets or G air mets and sig mets. You're taught basically how to do look at a surface observation, how to kind of decode a TAF. And you know what those are for, but there's lots of details, underlying details about these products that are just not taught very well. And I'll give you an example. For instance, we're not seeing any right now, any severe, this is all active SIGMETs. Yesterday there was some SIGMETs for severe turbulence out there. And again, one of the elements I try to show is that these SIGMETs just don't come out of anywhere. They're actually issued by forecasters, and these forecasters rely, for instance, a lot on pilot weather reports. So I always say that SIGMETs live and die by pilot weather reports. Not convective SIGMETs as much, but certainly SIGMETs for turbulence and SIGMETs for icing are generally done only when pilots begin to report those conditions. And so in reality, it's kind of telling you about what's happening right here and now. And that's also true of convective SIGMETs that you see here, that it's telling you about where convection actually is occurring that meets very specific criteria. So these are all elements, I think, understanding the basic principles of weather all the way through to understanding the various different products or the guidance that could be thrown at you. But it's also, again, kind of the administrative aspect of this. It's the products themselves, but there's a lot of administrative meteorology that goes on behind the scenes as well. And I'll give you an example is things like when these date time stamps are shown up here for the particular issuance of convective SIGMETs, for instance, understanding when they are issued and essentially how often they're issued. So all that criteria that goes into that, or any of the products themselves. We can look at some of the more advanced products, such as some of the forecast radar products, and again to try to get a better understanding for how often is this issued, and essentially when is this available, and how long is it valid for? In this case, this is instantaneous precipitation that you see. So it's kind of showing you a snapshot of where it would look like at a particular time. But when you go to other products, such as the 6-hour QPF, for instance, this is valid over a 6-hour period. So that makes it kind of challenging to use the various different tools, because you do have to understand kind of when they're valid. And that's, again, another aspect of this as well, is being able to kind of work through all those details. I think the best approach, if you are just learning to fly, or you're just getting into flying, or maybe you've only been a pilot for a couple years, it's really hard to find good, solid aviation weather training that's kind of above and beyond what you have to know for the check ride. And there are a lot of websites. The folks from Bold Method do a great job, but I would shy away from some of the real basic stuff that you'll get, like for instance with AOPA. And I'm not saying that their particular programs that they have, the videos they have, are not worth it. Some of the accident studies they have done and pushed out there are really good from that perspective. But a lot of their, one that is basically called the Thunderstorm Challenge, which had a lot of very bad information in that particular program. And I've addressed that with AOPA, and they came back and we fixed some of the problems. But this keeps coming up again and again, mostly because they don't have a person out there that has a weather expertise that's kind of charged with making sure that what is being put out is correct. Pilotworkshop.com also does a pretty good job overall putting out their VFR and IFR Mastery Series. I would strongly recommend that. I'm working with them as part of that. And they use a scenario-based approach for that. So I find using a scenario-based approach, at least for me, is a fairly easy way to teach. but it also brings things to a practical level. And one of the things I also do, and I know this may be a little bit self-serving here, but ultimately, if you were to go to the home page here and bring up, you'll see this training right here. And if you go to the EZWx training site, you can sign up for one-on-one training. And we'll talk about any subject whatsoever with respect to weather, but one of the best applications of this is if you're planning a route from one airport to another, or you're doing some long-range planning trying to say, I know that I'm going to be able to have no problem getting there. I just don't want to be stuck and I need to get back, 3 or 4 days later. So I can certainly help walk you through that process. Now, I'm not doing any briefings per se with you. I'm just trying to train you on the process. The goal is to make you smarter at doing this, and certainly we'll be using the Easy Weather Brief application for that purpose as well. And in the end, I think the overall emphasis of this kind of a detailed one-on-one training is so that you can ask questions and I can respond kind of directly to your questions and get to a point where I feel like I know what you're missing in terms of the actual weather knowledge. For some folks, it's a lot of holes in their knowledge base. In some cases, they have been taught improperly, and those kind of misconceptions can certainly work their way into your pre-flight briefing. Knowing exactly kind of how to walk through a briefing so that you can once again understand that big weather picture is really critical to getting a good understanding and making sure that you're making the right decisions. And it's not just always about making a decision to fly, but also you don't want to necessarily make a no-go decision or a decision to stay when you could have flown as well. Again, not saying that making a decision to stay is never a bad decision. It always is a good decision per se, but we want to also be able to use our aircraft to get places, and making a lot of no-go decisions when you don't have to, you're obviously missing something, and as a result of that, that's also part of the process here. And so the other aspect of this is I do have a book that I sell. It's co-authored with Doug Morris, who is a Boeing 787 captain from Air Canada. So both of us are meteorologists, so as our background is in meteorology, we're able to provide a fairly good representation for a good kind of textbook that you can use as a reference and learn a little bit more about what's happening with respect to the various different aspects of weather. So if you want to learn more about how to read a constant pressure chart, that's a good source to start with. But I will say that still the one-on-one training is probably one of the best approaches, simply because you can ask questions and I can get a better understanding for what pieces and components you are truly missing. But practically speaking, doing route-based planning is kind of the best approach once you have a pretty good understanding of the overall aspects of weather. Then you can look at other aspects of the tools that you can drill down on. One of the tools I really like to kind of get pilots to use, and that is the SKU log P diagram. So if you go to the airport view here and then drill down using the SKU diagram, again, this will give you a lot of information, but I use this diagram more than anything as a tool to learn about weather. There's no doubt that we've got a lot of data being thrown at us left and right. This is a great tool to kind of drill down and see what's going to happen over a particular location. So this is a forecast out of Teterboro, for instance, and you can see in this case we've got a kind of a stratocumulus signature setting up here as a major weather system moves off the coast, and it can give you a lot of good information about the weather at that particular airport. But in the end, it's really a tool that I use from an educational standpoint. I get a lot of people asking me about why should I learn this diagram, and how can it help me improve my briefings. I'll be the first to admit that I don't use it on every single flight I take, or I don't use it on any single briefing I do with folks per se, but it comes in handy in certain situations. The example I give is, for instance, I was planning to depart out of Roanoke, Virginia. There was a pilot weather report for severe turbulence at around 11,000 feet. I just wanted to make sure I understood that what was happening there. I was able to bring up a SCUT and easily see it was a thin layer turbulence event, and no problem. I was able to climb, get on top, bounce around for a minute or two, and then I was on top of that layer, and it was smooth sailing from there. So again, the SCUT diagram comes in handy for a lot of different aspects of weather, but it's not necessarily a be-all to end-all in terms of giving you all the information you ever want. You can quickly and easily look up the from the SCUT standpoint what the freezing level might be. Gives you a really quick way to do that. But I would say that for anybody that hasn't spent any time learning this, just going through a kind of an basic understanding of the diagram itself, you're going to learn a heck of a lot about weather in terms of why does, when you lift air up, why does it expand and cool and eventually condense out. We call that a parcel of air. We lift it up and we see what happens to it. And parcel theory is a great tool to learn more about what happens in terms of the overall how the weather and how the environment is poised, so that you can make good decisions about altitudes, about routes, and certainly understand the magnitude of the weather you're faced with. And I find that the SCUT diagram gives you that opportunity to learn all that. And so if you're looking for a good program and you haven't already purchased it, you can go to my Watch Online workshops here, and then and you don't have to actually be a member to do this, but you can then go to let me go ahead and filter this by Premium Workshop here, and then you can at that point in time look for the Mastering the SCUT Diagram. It's a 3-hour program, and you can actually purchase this separately. It doesn't, the basic workshops come with the actual membership itself, but these premium workshops, these took a lot longer to build, and so I can't give them away for free as part of the membership, but they are, you can purchase those separately through EZWxChat.com. And again, you don't have to be a member to purchase them. You can actually create a trial, purchase the workshop. At that point, once you've purchased it, even if your trial expires, you can go back and view it as often as you like. But I would suggest for folks that really want to kind of dive deep into a subject of weather, this is a great tool to use to learn more about weather than anything else. And you're going to find, as you read through some magazine articles, you're going to see weather-related articles in those magazines. You're going to read online sometimes various different websites that would promote a particular subject on weather, try to teach you more about it. Be real careful. Look at the source. Is the person writing the article just any other instructor, or are they pretty well versed in meteorology? Do they have a background in meteorology? If not, I tend to shy away from articles that are not written by somebody who is an expert in that area, primarily because it's typically full of misconceptions. They might get some stuff right, but in many cases they get it wrong, and as a result, that ends up in your brain as a wrong concept, and that again can affect your pre-flight briefings if you don't quite understand what's going on. Again, I'm not saying all of it is bad, but it's really hard to determine what's good or not. And you'll see some, if you go to my blog, you'll also see some posts out there where I chastise some of the different websites for producing, less than stellar education out there from a weather perspective. So again, buyer beware in that particular area. And a lot of this is, when you are looking at some of the online stuff, a lot of it also is very cursory, very low level kind of training. It's almost as if they're, if you had any kind of problem with your computer and you called the help desk and they said, well, sir, is it plugged in? That kind of level of training that you're getting from some of these sites. And that may be okay if that's what you want to learn, if there's some basic aspects of weather. But it is really hard to find something that's going to take you to that next level. Not unheard of to read some other pure meteorology texts that are not dedicated for pilots, like my Pilot Weather from Solo to the Airlines book. I would not at all shy away from that for anybody who wants to kind of dig more deeply, and certainly you can reach out to me. I can recommend a number of books in that area that go into more details about weather in terms of understanding the meteorology itself. I don't expect, as I tell most of my students, I don't expect them to become meteorologists. I like to look at it from a standpoint of, for instance, if you're a musician, maybe playing guitar or piano, you may actually be a really good musician from that standpoint. You may be able to play a piano very well, read music, but you also may never write any music. That takes kind of a special skill, and certainly the same thing is true for learning weather in terms of piloting. You may never get to the point where you can actually make a forecast for yourself based on a lot of raw data, and that's okay. I don't expect anybody to be able to do that, but I do expect that pilots to be able to look at a particular chart, such as this one, the 6-hour QPF, and determine kind of what's happening with this particular element, what you can draw from this and what you can't draw from it, and how that you would roll that into your pre-flight planning. Now, with Easy Weather Brief, I tried to get to the next level and do some basic integration of a lot of this information. So a lot of that you see in all the different static imagery is available in digital form. And so when you're looking at the weather here for a route, I have data that's stored that is actually fairly high resolution along that route of flight. So it's not just taking information from the closest airports nearby. Certainly those closer airports are likely to be very similar to a route of flight, but not always. And so as a result of this, you're getting very high resolution guidance along that entire route. And then I can then look at your personal minimums that you set up here. Again, it's another, go to the user settings and you can set up your personal minimums for ceiling, visibility, crosswinds, icing, turbulence, convection, all those elements. And then I can evaluate for you along the route of flight what those evaluate to. So this obviously is a case where there's lots of issues along this route of flight, probably not something I want to fly VFR, lots of red showing up, some greens, maybe a yellow, but in general this is a flight that you're probably not going to want to take given the parameters that you have set up for your personal minimum. So again, this tries to integrate all that weather information, so what you're looking for are essentially a row with a bunch of greens in it. And if you have that scenario, that's a great time to kind of target to depart. This is the departure advisor, and that's kind of its purpose, is to be able to kind of show you what's happening with respect to that. And this is kind of the baseline of Easy Weather Brief, but this is not the final answer. Certainly you can look at the route profile, get a better kind of decision making along that route to determine whether you have icing potential, do you have turbulence issues, what altitudes make the most sense from that perspective. So I'm looking at icing, for instance, along this route. Certainly if I'm flying somewhere above 10,000 feet, I've got some serious icing issues to deal with here, and maybe even some SLD in some cases, but certainly a lot of areas here where it's showing up with heavy icing. So it allows you to kind of quickly look at your risk options, and as a result of that, setting up your profile, your settings for your personal minimums is also important to kind of keep in mind as well, because as you set those up, Easy Weather Brief for icing, or in some cases turbulence, I'm able to get a good indication if there's a severe turbulence down here near the surface, a good indication of what to expect along the route of flight. And then you can look at these individual screens here and make some determination of what's happening. Wow, this is a pretty deep weather system here in the east. No doubt that there's some clouds throughout the entire route of flight here. And then it'll give you a kind of better understanding for whether or not you're going to be flying in IMC, and whether or not icing or turbulence will be a factor here. But still, even though you have these interesting visualizations, which are very useful, I would still also tell folks to make sure that you're looking at that big weather picture, especially with the vertical aspect of weather, going to whatever model meets your needs. In this case, I'm going to look at the GFS model and kind of get an understanding for where what's causing the weather from the overall standpoint at the upper levels or lower levels. This 500 millibar constant pressure chart really starts to kind of hone in on where the true problem areas are. And this again goes out to about 5 days in the future, so you can get a really good understanding of what's to expect from that standpoint. So putting all this together involves looking at, with Easy Weather Brief, planning a route, taking a look at when the best possible departure time is, and then looking at the weather imagery to kind of get that big picture understanding, and making sure that you're not missing anything with respect to some of the weather depictions that you see in Easy Weather Brief. Okay, well, I've kind of rambled on enough here, so that wraps up episode 23 of Easy Weather Chat. My name, again, is Dr. Scott Denstead, and as always, I hope you enjoy the simplicity of Easy Weather Brief.